Broadcasting live and worldwide. Here's Brody Brazil.
Wanted to make this production as a direct response to some of the news stories I've been reading as of late, and a couple crashes with the Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft. Now, before I go any further, a lot of you are saying, wait, aren't you the sports broadcaster? What the heck do you know or care about aviation news? Well, I'm actually a licensed commercial pilot by the FAA. I'm also a certified flight instructor with an instrument rating through the FAA. That means I can actually teach people how to fly. And in fact, I have done that. Some individuals, some students have gone on to become professional pilots and fly airliners for their career. Now, it's not to say that I'm a person that's type rated on the Boeing 737 or any Airbus aircraft as well. I'm just telling you, I know a lot about flying. I know a lot about the training of aviation, have a lot of friends who are in the business itself. And so I feel well connected enough to come to you with the video to try and answer a couple questions, because everybody right now is specifically saying, is the Boeing 737 MAX 8 a safe aircraft to fly in? Is it safe enough to bring your family on right now? Would you fly on one right now? And so I wanted to kind of spell out how I evaluate every flight I'm a part of, whether that's as the pilot in command or as somebody sitting in row 32, seat F. All right. There's 4 ways to break down the safety of every flight. Now, when I do this as a pilot myself, I'm looking at the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and the mission. Now, this isn't for everybody because most of you probably aren't pilots, but I'm looking at myself from a sense of illness. Am I taking any medication? Stress, how stressed out am I? Alcohol, if I've been drinking, I'm not flying. Fatigue, am I too tired to make this flight? Or emotion, or also eating. That's another one too. How am I doing as a person before I hop in this plane and make some potentially life-altering decisions? Am I right? The aircraft. There's a lot of certification and equipment required for daytime flying and nighttime flying and instrument flying in bad weather. I could go into a lot of that. Is the airplane up to date on some of the directives it needs to have done to it over time? Some of the improvements and maintenance it needs over time? Has it had all its servicings? Has it been worked on and signed off properly? That's another thing we obviously all look at. The environment, that's the third one here. Specifically weather. Am I flying through a thunderstorm? That's probably not a great idea in a small aircraft like the ones that I typically fly. And then last but not least, this may be more of a military-related thing, but the mission itself. How critical is the mission at hand? Also, what am I going to be doing with this flight? Am I doing aerobatics? Am I doing dangerous low-level maneuvering? Am I flying in a part of a country and a landscape where there's mountainous terrain or long stretches over water without a sufficient backup plan? So again, pilot, aircraft, environment, mission. That's how I break down every flight I do from the pilot side. Now, from the passenger side, what you need to consider are those very same 4 things. You don't necessarily have control or knowledge of all those 4 things, but if you can kind of take the reputations at hand and everything you've gathered from your gut sense, you can make a pretty good decision on whether it is safe to fly on an airplane like the Boeing 737 MAX 8. And again, I don't want to get into too many of the details of the recent crashes that we've learned about, because that information is ever changing and ever evolving, and this video is going to live forever. I want to make this a little bit more evergreen as you, the passenger, try and figure out what's safe, what's not, and what comforts your mind about going on an airplane. The number one thing you should know before I get into that same evaluation is anytime you're going on a flight, cross country, across an ocean, or even just across the state, you are way more in jeopardy of becoming injured or hurt or even dying on the car ride to the airport. That is much more of a dangerous risk than typically the flight you're going to take via a major U.S. air carrier. All right, so just think about that first off before we get into the breakdown. The safest part of your day is going to be hopping in that jet and taking off. But as for the breakdown, the pilots, All right. Major U.S. airlines only hire the most qualified of pilots. In terms of hours, experience, the aviation community is tight, it's close-knit, and your reputation in it, it follows you. And there's not a lot of bad apples, nor are there a lot of bad pilots at that level of aviation. I'm talking about flying a Boeing 737 MAX 8 or an A320 or a 777. I could go on and on. Even regional jets. We can go down the line, up the line, wherever you want to go. If you're working as an airline pilot in the United States, you've done so many things just to get that job, and likely you covet that job. So typically pilots are rarely the problem. The aircraft. Now, sometimes things have come under scrutiny in terms of maintenance, because this is all important for an aircraft. It's not just the pilots at hand and that the airplane is always going to work. If you don't take care of something, it's like your car. If you don't take care of it in time, you're going to see some ramifications. But most airlines, legally, they have to comply, but they also want to comply because it's a business for them. They can't afford to have mistakes. Their business will not do well. So they do everything that they're supposed to do with their aircraft in terms of maintenance. And they also don't continue to fly older aircraft, right? In terms of cycles, that's the way of breaking down how much an airplane flies. Every takeoff and landing is a cycle. They don't want to have old airplanes, number one, because they're bad on fuel efficiency, but number two, because they start costing more to upkeep than to simply get rid of it and lease out a new aircraft. So the aircraft is rarely an issue. And in this case, we're talking about the 737 MAX 8. Is the aircraft the issue, or is pilot training the issue? And the pilot's ability to evade a faulty system by turning it off and hand flying the airplane instead of trusting the airplane for whatever it wants to do. The pilot-aircraft relationship, to me, it's interesting because I use an autopilot. If there is one and it's a phase of flight which I feel comfortable using it, I absolutely will. Usually talking about clear skies, visibility is good. If you're in what they call instrument conditions and you can't see out the front, you're in the clouds, sure, you can use the autopilot there just the same. But you have to almost have an inherent level of distrust with your autopilot. That's not something a lot of drivers, for example, are familiar with, because pretty much once you put the car in cruise control, or maybe if you own a Tesla and it has that autopilot feature, a lot of people just seem to trust it, set it and forget it, right? A good pilot, though, is never completely trusting what the autopilot of an airplane wants to do. Like I said, an inherent distrust. It's actually a healthy thing. And there's also this saying, too, that you actually want to never let the airplane fly you. You fly the airplane, it doesn't fly you. That's a saying, it's a mindset, right? And all of a sudden, you're thinking that the airplane is doing what it wants to do because you set the autopilot, right? You got to trust it. It knows what it's doing. Not necessarily. It might be flying it while you turn it on, but you have to be there constantly backing it up and constantly figuring out what it's doing now, what it's doing next, and what it's doing after that, especially if you're letting the airplane fly an approach in instrument conditions. So again, I hope that makes a little bit more sense here when we talk about the MAX 8, specifically the 7.3. Is it the airplane's fault for some of these incidents? Or is it the flight crew's a little bit of inability to understand the aircraft, stop it from doing what it wanted to do, and take ultimate responsibility as the pilot or pilots in command and hand fly the airplane out of danger? In terms of the environment, airliners, they pretty much go in most weather conditions. There's some things that will keep an airplane, a commercial airplane, from flying. There's not many of them, though. A lot of times you can fly above the weather. Certain wind conditions don't affect you. A lot of them are hit by lightning on a daily basis, and that doesn't necessarily have any real negative ramifications. So weather and the environment is not tremendously an issue for airlines. And then the mission is almost a non-factor completely, because the mission for an airliner is typically to get you only from point A to point B safely. There's no mid-air refueling. There's no aerobatics involved. It's a quite simple operation to get you and your luggage safely, again, from point A to point B. So the mission is always pretty simple, and that's usually the least of problems. So again, I hope that makes a little bit more sense as you think about safety of air travel in the United States: pilot, aircraft, environment, and mission. Those are the four things. You can break down the safety of every flight if you just consider those four things. And look, most times I have yet to find an airline flight that I don't want to be on, right? Because it always checks all the boxes for me. And I know a lot more about this stuff. I realize you're saying, well, how do I figure out if the pilots are qualified or if the airplane is airworthy and up to speed? But again, there's a lot of trust involved. But you have to understand that these airlines, they won't do well unless they are completely safe. Once they lose your trust, business becomes a lot more difficult. So I hope that brings a little bit of insight into what's going on right now with the 737 MAX 8. Would I fly it? Absolutely. With my family on board? Absolutely. Tonight, tomorrow, the next day. And I understand that they want to make some changes to the flight control systems to essentially dumb it down a little bit more so that the airplane won't necessarily try and correct an unusual attitude by pushing the nose down. It thinks the airplane is approaching a stall, so it pushes the nose down, the MCAS system. But what's been happening, they think, are that these airplanes are in level flight. The system reads it incorrectly and pushes the nose down into a descent that is not recovered from. Think about you with cruise control in your car. If the car all of a sudden accelerates, do you do something about it? Absolutely. You tap on the brakes, you disengage, and you don't put that cruise control back on. It seems like that might be the similarity of what's happening with the 737 MAX 8s. And so hopefully they get it figured out. Hopefully they make the alterations. Boeing has been a tremendously safe company for all these years. They've made quality aircraft for decades upon decades. And let's hope that all this gets squared away and that we can keep aviation and commercial flying as safe as we know it can be.